Like Enter the Gungeon? TombStar is hoping you do, because even without knowing this game's stated inspirations, the DNA in this one is plain to see. TombStar is a top-down shooter with roguelike elements. Its biggest selling points are a deep roster of different guns to discover and play around with, bullet hell-style gameplay, and tough-as-nails difficulty. It's also a tale of two games. In declaring itself a roguelike shooter, in naming all of its inspirations, such as Enter the Gungeon and Nuclear Throne, which are themselves also roguelike shooters, it asks to be judged on both of those axes. Which puts me in a very awkward position, because judged on one of these axes, it is an exceptionally, incredibly good game. And the other, well, it's not all doom and gloom, but I have a lot of thoughts. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today, we're liberating the eponymous planet of TombStar. Before we get too deep into the review, I did receive a free review copy of this game, so heads up. Right off the bat, the sickest part of TombStar is easily its enemy design. Enemies that bum rush you and dump a million bullets in your face, teleporting healers that love to hide behind their allies, this big lizard thing that vomits huge swaths of area-denying acid that also slows you. Heck, there's a dude that loves to hide in the back and call airstrikes on you over and over until you kill him. This game has absolutely phenomenal enemy variety, and even the lowliest grunt can be fun to face off against, especially when they've got friends. Because it just gets even better once you start mix and matching these guys. That enemy that sits on you and just dumps a big explosion of bullets is fairly manageable on its own, but becomes vastly more interesting to deal with when it's flanked by two guys with shotguns. You want to fall back from the walls of damage the shotgunners provide, but the second you're in a corner, that little robot ball is just going to chase you right into it and murder you. Every enemy in this game has its own varying tempo of attacks, and once 3 or 4 enemy types start coming at you at the same time, you start having to deal with some really complex, tactically satisfying situations trying to juggle all those threats. I absolutely love it. A+. This is stellar action game design. Throw in some moderately large arenas with a lot of terrain to tactically play around, cover to upend, and exploding barrels to screw with, and you've got a really fun and challenging core to build on. But TombStar's most devious design choice of all is also an incredibly simple one that completely changes up the game's rhythm. These cheeky little shits keep leading their shots! Okay, I know, that doesn't sound like a big deal, but this is not something bullet hell type games usually do. Normally in a bullet hell, most enemies will have a more or less set attack pattern that you can eventually learn and adjust to. At most, the game will include some fodder enemies that keep constantly laying down fire where you're currently standing to motivate you to always be on the move. Even Enter the Gungeon, one of TombStar's primary inspirations, only does this with specific enemies, but in TombStar, literally every enemy, no matter how lowly, will get the jump on you if you're not paying attention, so you can't fall back on the classic circle strafe method and turn your brain off anymore. The AI wises up to that pretty quickly. This makes avoiding damage in TombStar a little more art than science. The only way you'll get good at it is by playing for a while and getting a feel for roughly when the AI decides to flip the switch and start leading its shots. Amusingly enough, I've actually found that the best defense of all is to just stand still, a way to manage the chaos of a given fight by keeping the AI from getting too creative with where it aims its shots. This also incentivizes you to put as much distance between yourself and your enemies as possible. They're less predictable than in a lot of other games, and most attacks don't have any kind of wind-up to give you time to react to their attacks, so you're kind of actively encouraged to hang back in a corner of the game's large arenas where you actually have time to react to what they're doing. Naturally, the game loves to counter this with aggressive enemies that are more than happy to get right up in your face when you try to hang back, leading to a lot of cat and mouse fights where you're constantly on the back foot, trying to maintain whatever distance you can. And screwing up is costly as well. You can only take about a half dozen hits across 8 zones in an hour-long run before you're sent back to the start screen. You can obviously find healing items to extend that number, but the margin of error is extremely thin. It requests the kind of perfectionism where I feel bad when I don't perfectly clear the entire first zone, which entails a dozen firefights without taking a single hit. All of this combined to make me play TombStar as a very cautious, defensive game, one largely about risk aversion, target prioritization, and proper spacing. Where most roguelikes want you in the thick of it, everything about this game's design is screaming for you to hang back and avoid risk wherever possible. It's a credit to the game's design that despite this fact, it still feels incredibly fun and tense to play. The game is aggressive enough that even playing like the cheapest corner-peeking coward imaginable, it will still chase you into that corner and flush you out immediately. and enemy encounters are so well designed that target prioritization becomes a fairly complicated and engaging question that has no real wrong answer. Every enemy is going to be a problem, so it's just about figuring out which problem relieves you of the most pressure, and this is only reinforced by the fact that most guns are balanced around specific breakpoints where even if you hit every shot, you'll only kill 1 or 2 enemies before you need to take a few seconds to reload. Moment to moment, it's a great time. But while I've spent a lot of time gushing about your opposition, I haven't spent a lot of time talking about your half of the equation. The characters, the progression systems, the pile of random guns you can find, and so on. And that's because while TombStar is a wonderful action game, it falls a bit short as a roguelike. I'm about to complain a lot, but I want to be upfront in stating that nothing I'm talking about is actively bad. Nothing here is an actual deal breaker. It's all just very underwhelming. At least to start. I want you to imagine a roguelike game where you stumble upon a level's shop, the place where anything in the game could pop up, where the full brunt of the game's roguelike elements can come to bear, and see absolutely nothing interesting to buy in there. Actually fun toys to play with are pretty few and far between, and all the most powerful upgrades are also the most basic and boring. Just to start with, gun variety is a little on the lacking side. Just like Enter the Gungeon before it, one of the game's biggest selling points is its deep list of various wacky guns. But for every cool buzzsaw gun that ricochets off the walls, there's one like the Swift Scope, an epic rarity drop that was identical to my starting sniper rifle, except it did double the damage. The vast majority of guns and perks in this game feel good to use, but there is an appreciable difference between feeling good and feeling interesting or different. Most guns in this game feel extraordinarily similar to each other, to the point where even a shotgun and a sniper rifle feel identical aside from how often I have to reload. And when that's the case, what's supposed to be a giant toy box filled with all these different guns mostly boils down to using whatever kills things 20% more efficiently than everything else. To be clear, I've experienced some genuinely cool runs. There was a time I got a gun that shot chain lightning everywhere and cleared entire rooms at once. There was a time I got a perk that let me freeze enemies when I shot them. There was a time I got a buff that dropped a mine anytime I used my dash ability, and then I immediately went and blew myself up with it. The only problem is that the one thing every single one of these runs has had in common is that they all happened back to back around the 7-hour mark. This is because TombStar buries almost all of its most interesting toys behind a treadmill of unlocks you get from playing the game and leveling up. This is actually fairly standard roguelike design, but the balance of what's available up front and what's hidden behind the unlocks is a little bit off. Until you start actually seeing these unlocks, basic guns like the Swift Scope are the norm, not the exception. And you're going to get really used to seeing the same 6 basic perks over and over again for the first several hours. I spent the first 7 hours of this game utterly underwhelmed by the roguelike options on offer. There was zero opportunity to experiment and try to make varying builds, nothing memorable enough to make one run stand out against another, not even the joy of just discovering a cool gun that shoots a million lasers in every direction at once. TombStar left me incredibly cold for so long that I fully wrote and almost recorded a completely different script. And you know, better late than never, but man, that is an incredible level of investment required for literally half the game to finally come online. I am not the, oh, you gotta play it for 20 hours before it gets good guy. The only reason TombStar had my attention long enough for any of this to matter is that the rest of the game slapped so damn hard that for the first 7 hours, I didn't care that half of it didn't work. You could have removed the roguelike elements from this game entirely, and I still would have loved it. Probably would have loved it even more. And if the action half of this game had been anything less than almost perfect, I would not have made it this far. But I did. So now we have to ask the big question. What do you get out of 5 hours with TombStar? We just got finished talking about how the game withholds a few too many of its most interesting or effective upgrades behind a multi-hour treadmill of level grinding, making for an extremely anemic roguelike experience that is only just starting to get marginally better beyond the 5-hour mark. That makes this game a little harder to sell to anyone that won't be spending much time with it, but I will also say that it didn't stop me from having an immense amount of fun from the very first second. Runs in this game are also extremely short, and so it feels like I've gotten to actually play a lot of this game. At most, a successful run is going to take you an hour, but me being rather bad at the game, most of my runs lasted about 10 minutes. So while I haven't gotten very close to beating it, I can say that it is a fast-paced game that is always on the move and doesn't waste any of your time, and because of the short runs, it's also a perfect game for playing in short bursts. Ultimately, it's telling that despite the roller coaster experience I've had with TombStar, I've never had that moment where I've picked up a gun and gone, oh, it's the Lazy Comet, I love that gun, this is gonna be a great run. I've played and enjoyed a lot of roguelikes. This is my bread and butter. It is a running joke of mine that I will play any deck builder you throw in front of me and probably like it. I've played and enjoyed a lot of roguelikes that even have a shallower pool of loot to discover, and those games could still make me feel that emotion. That moment is just so important to the roguelike experience, and I have to dig so deep to try and find it in TombStar. For any other roguelike, this would be absolutely damning. But I just love the basic gameplay way too much to let that ruin my fun. This game absolutely rips. I was having fun from almost the very first minute I played, and I am still having fun now. I have incredibly messy feelings about this game, and sometimes that's just how it goes when you respond to a work of art. But I can still sit back, look at it all, and go, you know what? I don't care. I love it anyway. So that's TombStar in a nutshell. I think you should give it a look, and if you've got some spare cash after that and like this video, consider hitting up my Patreon, because I too need to eat and would very much appreciate the tip. But I hope you enjoyed this review of TombStar, and I'll see you all next time.